Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Broadband Insider Series. Today I'm joined by Christopher Ali, author, associate professor of media studies at the University of Virginia and fellow at Benton Institute. Chris, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is awesome. We were just chatting before going online about sort of having a period of rest coming into 2021 and feeling re-energized, which is great. Definitely something that I think we all need at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Both academics, broadband advocates, academics and broadband advocates. We all needed a break.
Certainly. So right off the bat, can you just give a bit of background actually into your work in broadband over the years for anyone unfamiliar with it? I think that'd be a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been researching and writing about broadband for the last 5 years. I hold a PhD in communication studies and I specialize in communication policy and regulation. So kind of come to broadband pretty honestly in terms of the policy conversation. This all began because over the last 5 years, I've been researching and writing a book on rural broadband policy and deployment in the United States. That book is called Farm Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. And it will be out in September by MIT Press. And in that, I became really interested in the digital divide in terms of deployment. I know that there's multiple digital divides that kind of permeate this world, but I'm really interested in why is it that after 10 years of funding broadband deployment, we have not come anywhere closer really to solving the digital divide. In fact, I would argue that the digital divide between the un and underconnected and those who are hyperconnected is getting wider, not actually shrinking. So a lot of my work was doing a ton of policy analysis, a ton of crunching of numbers to figure out who's getting money from whom and who controls, these pots of money, the FCC, USDA. So that was a huge part of the research. And then a second part became, because it turns out that if you spend 2 years researching policy, you don't really have a human dimension on any of this. It just becomes words and legalese. So in the summer of 2018, I started a series of interviews, which then transitioned into what I called the rural broadband road trip. So my hound dog Tuna and I drove 4,000 miles across, particularly the Midwest, talking to rural broadband providers, spending time in small towns, spending time in cities, talking to anyone and everyone, including random people at grocery stores who would want to share their experiences with or without broadband. And that really helped me put a human face onto broadband and really provided the book with a lot more context and a lot more kind of lived reality. Following that, I wrote an article for the New York Times on the need for a national rural broadband plan, something akin to the Rural Electric Administration and Rural Electrification Act that electrified and then put telephony through to rural America. How we can bring that into kind of contemporary politics. And I've been lucky enough from 2019 to 2020 to be a fellow at the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, which really helped me kind of hone my writing and give me a bit of a platform to talk about some ideas and brainstorm some ideas. And now, I'm getting ready for the book to come out, have a couple of articles that are going to come out as well in the next few weeks. So I'm excited, but ever mindful about what's going on in our broadband world.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I think the idea of taking that span of time and actually going out and talking to people and having that sort of human interaction is something that is, you'll probably agree, a bit rare in this space. Like you said, a lot of the conversation is centered in the clouds, if you will. It's sort of top-down conversation about what things should look like. I think one particular aspect of that, I know that you and I have talked in the past about sort of broadband with respect to the agricultural sector, like the concept of precision broadband and things of that nature. Based on your experience and your the experience talking to people and sort of interacting with this sort of rural problem, how important is broadband to the future of that industry, and what is being done and what needs to be done?
That's a great question. Broadband is the future of agriculture. For a number of reasons. When we think about ecologically, we need to farm smarter, right? We need to treat our land better. Broadband can help us do this because it can connect sensors in the ground. It can connect sensors. It can connect machines in the ground. It helps us avoid human error, for instance. Broadband is involved in everything from connecting combines to connecting silos to, I visited a farm in which it was a hog farm, and the pen had sensors all over it that connected back to the farmer's iPad. So he knew exactly where each one of his hogs were, and he would be able to tell which ones weren't drinking water, which was a sign of illness.
Wow.
Like, just these really, really cool things. For me, you know, I didn't grow up on a farm. I hadn't really been on a farm. So these were really cool, really cool things.
Yeah.
So broadband to the farm, this is precision agriculture. And the you know, all of the major manufacturers are moving towards this, but none of this is possible without connectivity. Because in an ideal world, you know, you've got your, let's say you've got your planter and you're planting, and you've got a computer screen in front of you, and you're able to see, okay, in this area, I need to plant deeper or I need to plant more because of soil analysis. And in ideally, you should be able to do that in real time. We have the technology to do that. If you don't have a high-speed broadband connection, you end up having to save everything on a USB, bringing it back to your computer, home computer, where hopefully you have broadband. If you don't, you're driving it to the closest town to upload a huge amount of data for it to be analyzed by a third party, to re-download it onto your USB stick, to stick it back into your tractor to keep going. So it's time, it's energy, it's labor, and it's efficiency, really. So there's been a huge push, actually, amongst the agriculture community, both industry and individuals, for broadband to the farm to be kind of recognized as an important feature of broadband. And we started to see this a little bit. There was the Precision Agriculture Act, which encouraged the FCC to get more, to study in more detail what's going on there. John Deere is certainly really involved in this. Land O'Lakes has a huge coalition. Land O'Lakes, of course, is that butter company, dairy company, famous for butter, that brought together a tremendous number of high stakeholders, kind of high-level stakeholders who think about precision agriculture. Like I said, John Deere and all the major manufacturers are doing that as well. I think the really interesting thing, well, one of the really interesting things, just about outside of just how cool this is we really have to get into a conversation about technology when we talk about broadband to the farm. I think for a lot of us in towns and cities, you know, we harp on like fiber, right? Fiber to the home, fiber to the home. Fiber doesn't actually work that well in farms because you can't have fiber to the tractor because the tractor is moving. You know, that sounds ridiculous, but like it's a really interesting nuance to the universal fiber conversation, because what actually works best there is fixed wireless, right? Maybe fiber to a tower, because you're covering a huge amount of area. You just can't possibly cover that amount of area with fiber. So there's a really interesting opportunity here for fixed wireless and the development there. You know, I'm always for fixed wireless with a fiber optic backhaul, but you know, I think this is, for me at least, you know, when I kind of jumped on this, I was like, oh, fiber for all, but I'm like, actually, no, there's a lot of nuance here that we need to be thinking about it. And fixed wireless goes a long way in connecting America's farms. And I really think that should be acknowledged. When we talk about, you know, universal broadband, right, and the farms, and yeah, so you know, I would encourage anyone who's listening, anyone who's watching, to see if you can, you know, see some of this technology in action, because it is really cool, and it really is the future. It's really going to be the future of farming.
Yeah, I think the aspect of, I mean, that's interesting that you hear you say that. I mean, intuitively, I've sort of recognized fixed wireless as its potential for, you know, this sort of, I would call it niche, but it's not really niche. I mean, this like essential role. But it's something that I think is only just catching up in terms of the conversation around technology, right? As the potential for it with a fiber backhaul.
Absolutely, yeah. I think maybe got dismissed a little early in the conversation. I mean, certainly as we're looking to pivot away from DSL and in some cases pivot away from coaxial cable as well in DOCSIS. I think that fixed wireless, you know, does really great work, particularly in communities that are really spread out. And those happen to be agricultural communities, but they can also be things like vineyards. right?
Right.
We don't often think about vineyards as being part of the agricultural community, but of course they are.
Yes.
So and they own a ton of land and are as advanced with their data collection processes as any soybean farm or wheat farm. So let's
Mhm.
bring them into the conversation as well and think about how can kind of fiber fueled fixed wireless really benefit every aspect of agriculture. And you can still run fiber to the barn, you can still run fiber to the shed or the hog pen, right? That's not saying, but what do we do with these hundreds of thousands of acres that you can embed sensors such that every stalk can give you data? Like, it's
Mhm.
amazing how much data can be generated by corn or by soybeans.
Yes.
But we need to find a way to get that data in real time from that sensor to be analyzed,
Mm.
right? Yeah.
At a higher level, sort of related to this, you published a paper late last year in the International Journal of Communication, where you argued that rural broadband policy has failed in three capacities, I think: meaning, mapping, and money, the three M's, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Would you just speak a bit about that? Because I think it's related to what we're saying right now.
Yeah, and this kind of gets into the weeds of policymaking, particularly at the Federal Communications Commission. I've got another paper that deals with USDA and what they've done. So what I say is one of the major reasons, in my opinion, and through my research, why we have failed to see universal broadband or failed to see the rural urban digital divide shrink significantly, despite, again, $10 billion a year, kind of roughly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe 6 for deployment and then up to 8 to 10,
Sure.
is we've got a failure of meaning being what is broadband, right? And here the FCC, by continuing to hold on to this definition of 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload, has
Yes.
really locked us into 2008 internet. And we saw this with saw this with the RDOF auction, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. We saw this with the CAF2 auction. Companies continue to bid at baseline, right? At that 25.3. That's ridiculous, right? So we have a failure of meaning. We have a failure to think about current and future use, and rather we're just kind of embedded in this 25.3. But what does that allow? What does that 25.3 allow companies to do? Continue to have DSL on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It keeps DSL around. And I'm all for technological neutrality, but I love the line, and this comes from colleagues. I've heard it in Minnesota, and I've heard it from the NRECA, that you can be technologically neutral, but you can't be technologically blind. And I think a
Mm-hmm.
definition of broadband at 25.3 is technologically blind, because it allows too many entrants that are no longer able to handle the bandwidth and the data capacity that are used by Americans, specifically in a time of COVID when we're on Zoom kind of all the time. So that's meaning. The question of mapping, we all know this. I think this is something that's a conversation that's been had but continues to need to be had, right? Which is the failure of the FCC to map broadband deployment, unconnection, underconnection, the census blocks, Form 477. I don't want to beleaguer this to our viewers, but that's the failure of mapping, right? And hopefully, with the Broadband Data Act and now the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which gave the FCC $65 million, we'll see some big movement in mapping. I wish we would have seen that before the first round of RDOF money came out, because it could have just really helped a whole lot more to deploy $16 billion that way, with proper maps rather than outdated ones. And then last, so we had the failure of meaning, the failure of mapping, and the failure of money. And what I argue here is that looking back on how the FCC spent early Universal Service Fund money or Connect America Fund money for broadband deployment, starting in 2013, 14, and in particular 2015 with the Connect America Fund Phase 2, it was a handout to big telco.
Mm-hmm.
Hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And all big, I say big telco, these are like the national chains, right? Just as your AT&T and CenturyLink and Frontier and Windstream and stuff like that. They got hundreds of millions of dollars a year for a very low speed commitment, right? 10 megabits per second down, 1 megabit per second up was their commitment. And yet some of them even failed to meet their promises. Both CenturyLink and Frontier failed to meet their promises for 2018 and 2019. So these kind of handouts without an auction, right? Without opening up eligibility, just kind of giving money to companies without a whole lot of checks and balances, to me is a failure of money, right? That's $9 billion to put DSL in the ground. You know, that's a shame, I think. And so we saw some changes with the CAF2 auction where we saw more entrants. We saw a lot more electric cooperatives. We saw WISPs, the wireless internet service providers. They got involved in there. And then with RDOF, you know, that RDOF got a little messy. But I want us to move away from just giving handouts to the largest telecommunications companies and rather make the bidding process, A, to have a bidding process constantly, but also B, to make that bidding process much more, to broaden the eligibility and to make it much more democratic, because I think that the small providers, the co-ops, the municipalities, the local ones are much more nimble and much more responsive to their community needs than some of the largest telecommunications companies. So those were my three failures. And all in all, I called this, or kind of defined rural broadband as the politics of good enough, right? So the whole idea at the FCC was, let's just get something in the ground quickly, or let's just get someone connected. Doesn't matter at what speed, let's just get them connected.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work that way for broadband, right?
Mm-hmm.
If someone has 4.1, you know, or dial up, their broadband, first of all, that's not broadband, but also their internet experience is so limited, it's almost unusable. They can't even have a conversation like this, right?
Yes.
So I argue that the kind of that rural broadband policy making at the FCC has been defined by this politics of good enough, and that's kind of the phrase I wanna hammer home in my writing. And so it's something that we can all look out for, and something that we can push back on when we see it, right? Fiber isn't gold plated. Fiber isn't, I don't know, a luxury. It's not the Lexus versus the Toyota Corolla, right?
Right.
It's the Corolla. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it gets you to point A to point B with heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. Like that's fiber, right? DSL is a bicycle when we think about it, right? So I'm using this car analogy because that's sometimes was used to push back on me. Well, isn't just a luxury? It's not a luxury, it's a right, and it's a necessity. High speed, or as John Sallett calls it, high performance broadband just can't be achieved by some of these older technologies.
Certainly. I couldn't agree more. And on that note, in one of outgoing FCC Chair Ajit Pai's last speeches, he stated that we should move away from Universal Service Fund contributions and rely more on congressional allocations. I understand you have a different perspective. Would you mind just giving your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so Universal Service Fund, which is the contributions that telecommunications companies pay into the fund and then kind of get back through the Universal Service Fund, Connect America, RDOF, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really skeptical about a massive changeover between these ongoing contributions and congressional appropriation. I'm also sensitive. I've had this long conversation on Twitter actually just yesterday about this, and just reminded me to like, I'm also sensitive to the fact that the Universal Service Fund contributions do get passed on to consumers. So I never want consumers' bills to go up. That being said, we have RDOF going on right now. So if we did a massive switch to congressional appropriation, what happens to RDOF, which is already pretty messy? Universal Service Fund is also, it's a 10-year program when you get it. And so companies are factoring this in to their operating expenses, not just capital expenses, right? And because we know it's not just about putting wires in the ground, you also have to manage, you have to provide the service,
Yes.
which is expensive, which is also a market failure in rural America or in remote places. Just because you got the wires in the ground or the fixed wireless in the air, it doesn't mean then you can afford to keep the lights on or the transmissions going, right? You need kind of this ongoing assistance. And that was the thing about universal service. It wasn't, the one-time grants like USDA provides. It was the ongoing 10-year commitment that you could kind of, trust your watch by, I guess, or plan your, I don't know what the expression is there. And that's not guaranteed with a congressional appropriation. In an congressional appropriation, you have to fight every year or maybe every 3 years, right?
Hmm.
There's always a threat that it can be politicized. Look at PBS, look at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, right? That contribution has been frozen for almost 20 years,
Hmm.
right? And we still try and defund it. What happens if someone wants to defund broadband? That's the thing about universal service. And so these are my concerns when we want to switch entirely away from a contribution system to a congressional system. I'm all for more money in broadband. I was a huge champion of James Clyburn's Affordable Accessible Internet for All Act, $100 billion. Yes, absolutely. But even if we get a wire to every single American household and apartment building, residents and business, these rural companies still need to constantly have the customer service and the engineers necessary to keep the internet flowing, right?
Certainly.
So we're not going to suddenly have more people in rural nor customers in rural America. So we need an ongoing operating expense fund. That being said, we need reform. Absolutely. What is it now? 31% revenue contribution. That's bananas. So it's a big question. It's a huge question. It's bringing together a huge number of stakeholders, and not just the usual characters. This can't just be a conversation between AT&T and the Federal Communications Commission, which is sometimes I worry what this is. Right? We're all invested in this because we all pay into it. So, I think what we're going to see it with a new FCC. I've heard some names floated for who the chair might be, but I think, regardless of who the chair is, the Biden administration will see a much more consumer-focused FCC, a much more public-focused FCC, and maybe we'll start to see some convening around very meaningful USF reform.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I think to sort of play on that a bit and shift perhaps to a slightly more cautiously optimistic tone here. What, if anything, are you most excited for over the next few years in the broadband space, just in terms of initiatives or potential policy proposals, technologies, with the context of a new Biden administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think three major things I'm pretty excited about. One is that I'm pretty optimistic that we'll see meaningful net neutrality legislation. I think that's the place we have to start, right? That makes sure the FCC has authority over Lifeline, that stops Comcast from doing what it's doing, maybe with data caps. We need net neutrality. That's a must. I think we have a very good chance. 3 years ago, the FCC wrote a paper and said it will cost $80 billion to connect this country with fiber, and I think people were like, that's a crazy amount of money, $80 billion. But now when we're passing $1 trillion stimulus packages, suddenly $80 billion doesn't seem like a lot of money. So I think we actually have a window right now, a very meaningful and significant window to pass a massive broadband stimulus package akin to James Clyburn's Affordable Accessible Internet for All Act, $100 billion. What's $100 billion in a $1.4 trillion stimulus package? Suddenly the numbers seem a little bit easier to digest. And when we've all recognized how that broadband is a life or death issue during a pandemic, I think we can see some really meaningful action. So net neutrality, huge congressional action in terms of broadband deployment. And the third thing I'm really excited about is the potential for, we will see a change at the FCC. I'm really looking forward to seeing an FCC, like I just said before, that is much more consumer oriented, that is much more public focused, that is not interested in just off-putting or putting off a lot of its responsibilities into other agencies, or just failing to do its job. I think in a Biden administration, we're really going to see an FCC, or I hope at least an FCC that takes the public interest, convenience, and necessity mandate seriously and significantly, which means we might see things like serious considerations about mergers and acquisitions, right? We saw massive levels of mergers and acquisitions in broadband and in broadcasting, obviously in newspapers and tech as well, but maybe we'll start to see some pretty meaningful action there. So net neutrality, massive broadband deployment and access, changes at the FCC, and lastly, of course, it's not just about broadband deployment. It has to be about digital inclusion. we need to improve Lifeline. We need to improve E-rate. All of these things I think are possible with this kind of sea change, both at Congress and at the FCC. And I really think this 2021 could be broadband's year. If 2020 was the year in which we all realized broadband is a right, 2021 could be the year that we really make meaningful steps to making sure everyone has access to broadband.
It's an exciting sentiment, Chris, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that point that you make about 2020 being sort of the final straw for understanding broadband's importance, that's so key. I mean, I think that was felt across industries, across political lines in America last year. It really feels like more than any year since I've been paying attention, this feels like something that is becoming more universally understood. Even just amongst the general populace, and that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And with public support, about the importance of broadband, and public frustration as to why my broadband isn't working or why am I paying this much, it's just I don't know. I'm excited for really meaningful change.
Certainly, as am I.
Excellent.
Chris, thank you so much for this. Once more, you have a book coming out. What's the title of it? When's it come out, and where can people find it?
Absolutely. So I have a book coming out called Farm Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity. It will be out in September with MIT Press. You can buy it anywhere you buy a book. MIT Press website. We've got a website already up for the book. I think it's going to be $25.99. You can also buy it at Amazon. Probably not at a bookstore necessarily, but certainly any place you buy books online.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. This was excellent.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Awesome. All right. We'll talk soon.
Absolutely.